All right, let's dive right into this. Welcome, everyone. Today, we're taking a cinematic, historical journey into the very roots of our modern world. We're going to explore how the moral and ethical traditions of Judaism and Christianity actively shaped the bedrock of Western ideas, things like law, justice, and our individual duties. If you've ever stopped and wondered where that powerful idea comes from, the one that says a leader is absolutely never above the law, well, this explainer is going to map out exactly how we got here.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the roots in ancient Israel, then move on to Rome and the early Christians. From there, we'll look at uniting faith and reason, examine the clash of authorities, the turbulent era of Reformation and religious war, and finally land on the legacy of liberty. Together, we're tracing an unbroken thread of moral law from ancient texts right to the founding of modern republics.
Okay, Section 1. Roots in Ancient Israel, the Hebrew Tradition.
The profound concept that there's a moral law transcending royal decrees, that first takes root in the Hebrew Bible. Grounding ourselves deep in antiquity, we see that this idea of a divine obligation didn't just pop up overnight. It actually began with the era of Abraham, which established the very first covenant. Then we see it renewed during the era of Moses, who led the Hebrew people out of slavery in Egypt and received the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. And finally, this tradition gets cemented by the prophets, like Amos and Isaiah. It's a continuous, multi-generational building of ethical standards.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the word covenant. Found in books like Exodus and Deuteronomy, a covenant wasn't just some basic treaty. It was a binding agreement that placed shared moral obligations on everyone. It literally bound an entire people to divine justice, not just the fleeting whim of a king. Just imagine how radical that was back then. A law that applies to the ruler just as much as the ruled. Absolutely groundbreaking.
To really understand why this matters, let's contrast two major ancient worldviews. On one side, you have Greek philosophy, which was mostly driven by human-centered reasoning. But on the other side, the Hebrew tradition introduced this sweeping vision of divine justice. What this meant was that moral accountability existed completely independent of the state. Human law actually had to answer to a much higher standard of righteousness. It wasn't just about what made logical sense to a ruler, it was about what was objectively just in the eyes of the divine.
And we really see this play out vividly when the prophets speak up. Take Amos, for example. He wasn't some powerful noble, he was just a simple shepherd. Yet he stood right up and fiercely condemned wealthy merchants who were cheating the poor. Or look at Isaiah. He warned kings that all their fancy ceremonial worship meant absolutely nothing, literally zero, if they weren't providing social justice for the most vulnerable, like widows and orphans. These figures cemented the idea that protecting the vulnerable is a non-negotiable moral requirement for anyone in power.
Moving right along to Section 2, Rome and early Christians spreading the moral law.
Building directly on that Hebrew tradition, Jesus of Nazareth emphasized that love, justice, and mercy were our most fundamental moral duties. And after the crucifixion, the early Christian community literally took these ideas on the road. Through the missionary journeys of people like the Apostle Paul, these moral concepts spread like wildfire across the Roman Empire and straight into Western Europe. Paul actually did something fascinating. He bridged Judeo-Christian faith with Stoic reasoning by arguing that a natural law was written on every single human heart. He insisted that every person, no matter their rank, owed duties of compassion to others.
As this faith grew, early theologians had to figure out how it fit into the messy political world. Enter Augustine of Hippo. After converting in 386 CE, he wrote a massive, monumental work called the City of God. In it, he philosophically separated the world into two distinct spheres. You have the earthly city, which is governed by force, power, and self-interest. And then you have the heavenly city, governed by pure love and perfect justice. He was drawing a very clear line in the sand, showing that corrupt earthly power was entirely separate from the higher, perfect standard of the divine.
Which brings us to Section 3, Uniting Faith and Reason, Medieval Theology.
So how exactly do you systematically combine biblical ethics with classical philosophy? Well, in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas takes on this massive task. In his absolute masterpiece, the Summa Theologica, he logically mapped out four interconnected types of law: eternal, natural, human, and divine. His brilliant main argument here was that human law must conform to those higher orders. A king couldn't just invent a law that violated natural or divine law and expect it to hold any moral weight whatsoever. Aquinas didn't stop there. He also applied this logical framework to warfare, giving us what we now call just war theory. For a war to be morally justified, he argued it required three specific things: a just cause, proper authority, and right intention. I mean, think about how revolutionary that is for the Middle Ages. He was placing firm moral limits on military force. This incredible synthesis of faith and classical reason would end up guiding Western political thought for centuries. Next up, Section 4. Clash of Authorities, Church versus State. So, what happens when earthly kings clash with church institutions that claim they speak for a much higher divine law? To understand this inevitable conflict, we have to look at canon law. This was the system of laws applied by church courts across medieval Europe. They handled everyday stuff like marriage and inheritance, plus heavier things like heresy. But crucially, the Catholic Church claimed that divine law stood way above the authority of any earthly king. As you can probably guess, asserting that kind of papal supremacy set the Church on a direct collision course with monarchs who totally believed their power came directly from God alone.
The ultimate showdown over this happened in 176 during the investiture controversy. Pope Gregory VII took the massive step of actually excommunicating the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV. And the result is one of the most dramatic scenes in all of medieval history. In January 1070, Emperor Henry walked barefoot through the freezing snow to Canossa just to beg the Pope for forgiveness. This incredible winter vignette established a lasting constitutional limit. Political authority has moral boundaries, and yes, even the most powerful rulers on earth can be held accountable to a standard far beyond their own power.
Let's move to Section 5, Reformation and War, a divided Europe.
Let's see how this builds, because the Protestant Reformation forced all of Europe to drastically rethink political authority. The fracture kicks off in 1517 when Martin Luther famously posts his 95 Theses in Wittenberg. This protest gets further developed by figures like John Calvin in Geneva. But tragically, this theological fracture leads to brutal religious wars, culminating in the horrific 30 Years' War, before a completely exhausted continent finally agrees to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648.
8 million. That is the estimated number of people killed during the 30 Years' War. It's just a staggering, devastating cost for sectarian conflict. But out of this unimaginable bloodshed came a vital realization. The absolute exhaustion of these nations ultimately forced them to adopt the principle of religious toleration. They realized that society simply couldn't survive without it.
Finally, Section 6, the Legacy of Liberty, Modern Democracy.
So how did all these ancient covenants and medieval philosophies merge into the founding vocabulary of modern democracy? Well, it all comes together around the concept of natural rights. The philosopher John Locke, in his famous 2 Treatises of Government, drew directly on Scripture to argue for these rights. He effectively translated biblical moral reasoning into the secular language of human rights, arguing that a legitimate government can only exist by the consent of the governed. He took that ancient idea of the covenant and applied it directly to modern civil society.
The crucial point is right here, in this specific phrasing. Endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. These are Thomas Jefferson's iconic words from the 1776 Declaration of Independence. And this quote perfectly proves the total merging of Judeo-Christian moral language with Greco-Roman philosophy into our shared political inheritance. By the 18th century, the idea that our rights come from a higher moral order, completely out of the reach of any earthly king, had become the absolute cornerstone of democratic theory.
We've traced an incredible 3,000-year-old legacy today, from ancient shepherds and prophets to emperors barefoot in the snow and finally to the architects of modern republics. But I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If modern democracy was built on this foundational idea of a higher moral law, how did these standards apply to holding our political leaders accountable today? What does that ancient covenant look like right now in our modern world? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it helped you clearly see the deep historical roots behind the laws that govern our lives. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.